Hello and welcome to our second talk of our Women in History talks. And tonight's talk is about Gwyneth Dunwoody, hosted by, I love this actually, it's such a great way of doing this, hosted by Laura Smith, who I will let to introduce herself. If you're watching not live and you do have any questions, then do feel free to email in on the email that you got the link from, and we will source the answers for you. But over to you, Laura. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Kate, and thanks so much for asking if I could do this. It's obviously a real honour, and it's amazing because I actually grew up when I was knowing Gwyneth from when I was a little girl. So I'll give a little bit of background into that just to put the context. So my dad was a very active member of the Crewe and Nantwich Labour Party. He, in those days, you used to kind of give up your house for the meetings. Sometimes they'd do it on a bit of a rotation. Our house was one of those houses that used to get used for the meetings. And as a little girl, I absolutely loved it because I used to get to be the person who would push in the trolley with the teas and coffees and hand out all the biscuits. And I'd try and kind of eavesdrop a little bit to some of the conversations that were going on. I don't think they were that exciting. I think it was a typical Labour Party meeting, I have to say. But I remember this fantastic theatrical woman would arrive, and she would obviously have everybody eating out the palm of her hand, and that, of course, was Gwyneth. And personally, I'll start with this because my dad, and I've spoken about this quite openly. He was very poorly for a period of time with his mental health and his confidence. As people know, when people suffer with mental health problems, his confidence really dipped massively with regards to work, etc. And Gwyneth not only was a friend of his in the Labour Party, she was an amazing friend to him personally, and she knew that to help him in his journey regarding his mental health and getting him out and about and socialising, etc., she decided that he was the only person who was fit to ferry her around the constituency when she used to come up from Parliament. So he was her unofficial official driver, and they got up to all sorts of mischief together. I will share a few of those stories tonight with you. And more than anything, she was just a remarkable friend to him and my mum. So it is quite personal. She used to think I was a little bit of a spoilt brat, I think, and I think it was probably fair to say. I used to get dragged around in this car with my dad sitting in the back, listening to these stories. It was very exciting and amazing to hear about this place that sounded like it was on another planet, the House of Parliament. But it was, she also heard all of those normal things that teenage people and small kids moan about, all the self-indulgent nonsense. And sometimes my sister would be with us as well, and my sister was always a little bit strict with me, and you could see Gwyneth quite enjoyed it when I got told off. The remarkable thing is Gwyneth would never have a million years thought that I would have ended up going into Parliament and becoming the MP for Crewe and Nantwich, but for me, and I never thought in a million years that I would either. And listening to Gwyneth, this parliamentarian, this actress with this amazing kind of ability to hold and debate, I would have given my right arm to even be a tiny bit of what she was in being able to communicate, etc. But she would have been really proud that the working class girl who she kind of helped and stood by her dad managed to get into Parliament and see what it was all about for herself. So thank you for asking me, and I will crack on with Gwyneth. So yeah, Gwyneth Dunwoody. If we go to the next slide. So her early life, she was born in Fulham. She wasn't a Crewe person. She never claimed to be. She was born in Fulham in West London, and both of her grandparents were suffragettes. I'll talk a little bit more about her family. I spoke to my dad about it, trying to get some information. He has told me some snippets, but yeah, Gwyneth was born into a powerhouse of a family with lots of opinions, and she attended a school in Fulham, and yeah, she never claimed to be a constituency MP. She was a different type of politician, I guess. If we go to the next slide. So, as I said, she was born into a political family. Her father was a coal miner, and he was born in Wales, Morgan Phillips, and he was General Secretary for the Labour Party between 1944 and 1962. Now, I'm not sure how true this is, and I have tried to fact check it, so don't hold me to it if it's wrong. But I'm sure there's a story about Morgan Phillips was the person who kind of came up with the design of the Labour Rose, which is still obviously used today for the Labour Party. And on the other side of it, her mother, Nora Phillips, she was a member of London County Council, but then she became a life peer, and she was government whip for quite a period of time in the House of Lords, and she was also Lord Lieutenant of Greater London. And my dad told me this little story before, because the great thing about Gwyneth is I admire her massively on so many political elements, and there's lots that we would have agreed with on. There are other things that we would be very different on. Gwyneth was without doubt a royalist. I make no odds about the fact that I'm not, but I totally respect her kind of stories and her opinion on this. And one of the things my dad told me was her mother used to always be there at the airport, or whenever Prince Charles was coming back in. She was good friends with Prince Charles. And so whenever he was coming, well, Prince Charles the King, whenever Prince Charles at the time, whenever he was coming back into the country, Nora Phillips, Baroness Phillips, would be there to greet him. And Gwyneth showed my dad some letters that were handwritten by Prince Charles at the time, the King, and they were talking about her mother and what a wonderful support that was, having somebody who was a friendly face, who would greet. And they were, Gwyneth and Prince Charles, now the King, remained very close pen pals. And she definitely defended the royal family, and she saw the value in the royal family. So, as I mentioned before, Gwyneth's grandparents, her grandmothers, were both suffragettes, and all of her grandparents were Labour Party loyalists. I think there's a common trend throughout this talk, actually, and I like this, of a time of politics when people weren't pigeonholed in the way that we are now, in the you have to be this and that and this and that, and if you don't fit, then you're not allowed in our club. And it wasn't like that in the same way, and I really admire that. Gwyneth was able to be independent and have views that were completely in line with the Labour Party. You know, she was a trade unionist, she believed in workers' rights, she fought against privatisation, but on the other side of it, you know, she had other views that some people would consider not to be fitting in with the Labour Party now. But maybe it was a time when people were, I don't know, a little bit more open-minded for debate and conversation on things, rather than being massively offended all the time. If we go to the next page. So she left school at 16. She became a journalist, and you can totally see that in the way that Gwyneth was. And I remember this about her, how good she was with words and telling stories. And she used to tell jokes as well. And I remember being in the office in Crewe and listening to some of these stories, and she was hilarious. She was a trained actress, and you could tell in the way that she conducted herself. And yeah, everybody, if she was in the room, everybody was listening. That's for sure. So she joined the Labour Party back in 1947, and she spoke at the Labour Party conference in Scarborough. Now, obviously, I have been a member of the Labour Party, and I'm sure people watching this have attended conferences of different parties, or maybe they've been to the Labour Party conference. And it's not an easy thing to join a party and then to go and speak at its national conference. It kind of sounds a little bit less than it is. It's a big deal. It's a big room filled with people who are very opinionated. And I couldn't find a clip of Gwyneth doing it, but I did find a clip of that conference, which Kate's going to share. And I just love it because it kind of shows the period of time, the changes, the way, you know, the whole thing of that period of time Gwyneth was in Parliament, how different, and when she was involved in politics, really, how different it was at the start of her journey to where it ends up. So if we could play that, Kate, that would be amazing. Relying on tech, it's never a good thing.
It went on too fast then, hang on, I've got it ready now on my screen. It's like, hang on, hang on. Right, hopefully I've shared the sound. It should be coming on now to yours. Can you see it yet?
We can see it, yeah.
Yeah, I've not pressed play yet, so it should be.
Legislators make the most of it. Minister of Labour Isaacs leads the race for the morning swim. Chancellor of the Exchequer Stafford Cripps, caught by infectious holiday atmosphere, gets into the swim with the trippers on South Bay. His predecessor in office, Dr. Dalton, smilingly escorts Dr. Edith Summerskill, whose new hat promises to cheer an assembly more noted for its lack of headgear. The Minister of Health prepares to lambaste his immediate critics, and the President of the Council looks even further ahead to the elections of 1968. But duty calls. The Prime Minister and Mrs. Attlee head the line which moves towards the spa scene of the debate. Only a few steps behind come Mr. and Mrs. Shinwell. As President and Chairman of the conference, Mr. Shinwell carries the responsibility for steering the party's course through the shoals of a long list of controversial resolutions. His presidential address meets with approval, and the debate is open to all. That is, all except Mr. Edwards, outspoken opponent of steel nationalization, who joins Mr. Platts-Mills in the Nennigoat corner.
For anyone struggling with high blood sugar...
We don't need help on diabetes at this point. So yeah, I just really like that clip because it just kind of shows such a massive difference, right, to the way things are reported, and just the feel about it. I just think is fabulous. A little snippet of history. If we can go back to the PowerPoint, that would be amazing, Kate. Sorry, you're doing a marvelous job of controlling all of these buttons. Excellent. Thank you. Will that go big? Fab. Thank you. So yeah, Gwyneth wasn't the MP for Crewe in Crewe and Nantwich first of all. Her first stint was down in Exeter, and she was elected to Parliament in 1966. Her husband, John Dunwoody, he was a doctor. He was I think he was already an MP, or they might have been elected at the same time. Don't fact check me too much, but around the same time. And she quite quickly got into a position as a junior minister. She was parliamentary secretary for the Board of Trade. She did quite a lot of travel. There's a great picture up there of her inspecting what looks like some sort of china. She was an expert of all sorts of different bits and pieces. Some bits that, again, are controversial today. Gwyneth and I definitely wouldn't have agreed on her love of furs, etc. But the period of time, she was a big fan of fur, and she used to go off and find out about all of these different things and try and help with the trade deals. She wasn't in Parliament that long. When she lost the seat, she went on to have this great job as director of films, the Film Producers Association of Great Britain, and she was consultant to the Association of Independent Cinemas. And that really fits in with her theatrical love, and she had a bit of that Hollywood glamour, I would say, without a doubt. But it wasn't long, if we go on to the next one, before she was sent to the relatively safe seat at the, well, I think it was a very safe seat actually then, of Crewe. So it wasn't Crewe and Nantwich at the time. She was supported massively by what was the National Union of Railwaymen. That became the RMT. And honestly, I will talk a bit about her links with transport later on, but there's so many people who I've met who worked on the railways in Crewe who have such a, rightly so, such a high opinion of her. They absolutely loved her, and she stood by them and they have stood by her. She was also, during this kind of period, she was a member of the European Parliament. And it was different then because you weren't elected as has become, obviously not with us now, but as it was, you were nominated as national people in Parliament to be sent out to be in the European Parliament, and Gwyneth did. And yeah, she was a Eurosceptic. She would have enjoyed that debate on Brexit, etc., and would have had many opinions on it without a doubt. So in 1983 there was a boundary change, and it became the constituency of Crewe and Nantwich. With that, it wasn't quite such a safe seat anymore. There was a little bit of a more, you know, a little bit more of a chance of Gwyneth not being elected in. But again, as anybody who has ever door knocked, ever gone out and spoken to anybody in Crewe and Nantwich about politics will know, Gwyneth had this amazing ability to be able to connect with people across different parties. She was very respected by the farming community. She was respected by maybe some people who wouldn't usually vote Labour. Some of them actually used to stay at home because they wanted Gwyneth to get in. They wouldn't quite vote for her, but they wouldn't vote against her. And it was around this time as well that I found this great quote from Betty Boothroyd, who became the Speaker of the House. So Gwyneth and Betty were both in the European Parliament at the time, and Betty was she had the job of being the whip, and they went on to have a really long-standing friendship. I remember occasions where Gwyneth would talk about spending kind of time at the Speaker's house. I think they spent kind of lots of time around the Christmas break with each other. They really were good friends. Gwyneth was one of the people when Betty Boothroyd was elected to be the new Speaker of the House. They have this kind of weird parliamentary procedure where two people, I'm sure it's two, have to physically drag the person who's going to be the Speaker from their seat in the Commons up to the Speaker's chair. And this is something that's gone on for however long, donkey's years. And Gwyneth was one of the people who got to drag Betty Boothroyd up to the chair, and she seconded, I think, the motion. I don't know if she was the first person, but she played a key part in Betty getting that position. But their relationship wasn't always easy, and Betty Boothroyd described that it got off to a rocky start when we were both sent to the European Parliament as Labour MEPs in 1975. I was quite pro-Europe and Gwyneth was very sceptical and antagonistic. I was the whip for the Labour Party delegation, and she didn't like being called into order by the likes of me at all. And yeah, if Gwyneth didn't believe in something or want to do something, I wouldn't want to be the person who was facing her on that. If we go to the next slide. So yeah, I found just a collection of really lovely pictures to share when I was looking at this, which kind of shows Gwyneth in a different time period to when I knew her. I remember her through the eyes of being a very young person, and hearing the stories that my dad and my mum have told me. I just love these pictures. There are pictures of her here when she was on the Board of Trade traveling around. There were pictures of her meeting various people. She was part of delegations. She was very well travelled. I spoke to my dad before because I know that she was fluent in several languages, and he said she was fluent in, he thinks, French, German, Dutch, a number of languages. So a very, very clever woman. as well. We go to the next. Yeah, and this is, I guess, how I think of her and remember her, these pictures. She was a great speech maker, lovely kind of way of bringing people down without sounding rude. She was described as a battle axe, and I think she described herself as a battle axe. Don't know how I feel about that word, but she liked it. I've got a little thing that she said about that later on. But she knew the Labour Party, she knew Parliament, she knew politics, and she knew people. She knew how to communicate with them. One of the things that Gwyneth was best known for was the Transport Select Committee. Obviously, Crewe has a massive connection with the railway industry. And as I said before, that kind of respect that she had was just massive and continues today, rightly so. It wasn't just rail, it was air, it was buses, everything. She knew her brief. And believe me, from going into Parliament and seeing it from the other side, the amount of people in there who do not read their briefs, they don't turn up to things, they don't listen or scrutinise in the way that they should, and we would expect them to scrutinise things. Gwyneth was not one of those people. She knew what she was talking about, she read the papers, she turned up to the meetings, and she was always one or two or three steps ahead of most people. If we go to the next slide. Yeah, so under her leadership, and what she really became quite known for, was she was the chairperson. I think she always wanted to be the chairman. That's what she wanted to be known as, for the committee and for the Transport Committee. And she was a real thorn in Tony Blair's side. She did what the committee was supposed to do, and they're supposed to scrutinise the government and give very frank kind of reports back to the government about where they don't think things are going right. And Gwyneth did that, and her she felt her responsibility was with that committee and that role. And although she was in the Labour Party and that was her government, she was on their side largely, it didn't kind of it didn't take over from the fact that she was going to hold them to account. And they didn't like that. The Labour Party at the time, under Tony Blair, they wanted a chairperson who was going to be more pliant with them. And he tried to get rid of them. He tried to get rid of Gwyneth, and he tried to get rid of one other chairperson who was a bit of a thorn in his side. And it went terribly for him. It was described as a peasants' revolt. And all the backbench MPs, etc., they have, when it comes to electing a chair, it's down to each member to cast their vote. There was a real kind of push to get Gwyneth out, and as I've got a quote here from Stephen Pound, he said that it was a dreadful botched attempt and the House rose as one to save our Gwyneth. And that's a hell of a thing to happen under a government that had as much power and strength as Tony Blair's at that point. If we go to the next one, just a few quotes that were found about this sort of situation. So, as chairman of the Select Committee on Transport, Gwyneth was better known than any transport minister. She was a great thorn in the side of the government. They got so fed up with her, they tried to oust her from the chair in 2001. I gave a statement to the press saying that she was the best person for the job, and it was a mad, ludicrous thing to do. They wanted a quiet life, but Gwyneth never let anybody have a quiet life, and rightly so. That was Betty Boothroyd. And then you can see here, I'm afraid the government may regard this as an opportunity to change the membership, not because they think we are not doing a good job, but because they think they are. The government must accept that where they do things wrong, people will say so. Gwyneth was a voice of the people, and that's how she viewed that position, and she won, ultimately. We go to the next bit. Okay. And these principles are what she's known for. That's why people in Crewe and Nantwich remember Gwyneth. That's why parliamentarians remember Gwyneth. They remember the fact that she saw herself as a loyal Labour Party supporter. But if she didn't agree with something, she wasn't scared. She was really not scared to say how she felt about it. She represented her constituents, but she saw herself as a parliamentarian. She was a legislator. She was somebody who scrutinised laws. She saw the importance of the role. And I think a lot of that has died in Parliament to the extent of how it was. I found that quite shocking, actually. I clearly grew up with Gwyneth as a standard of how I thought it would be. And I was very surprised when I went into that position to see, as said before, very little scrutiny on some occasions for such big, huge decisions that impact all of us on a daily basis. Yeah, she wasn't a fan of the New Labour. She described, and I remember her saying this to my dad, that she stood still in her Labour values and where she felt she was, and the whole party kind of moved around her and manoeuvred, and there was this transition into it becoming more of a machine operation. And she didn't feel like it had a clear identity. And that was something that she spoke quite openly about on many occasions. But she really, since childhood, she described herself as a supporter of traditional Labour values. She loved the Labour Party, it was in her soul, and she held on to those things that her mother, her father, grandparents obviously taught her. Yeah, there's this great story just to share of she managed to make herself really unpopular. She used to always go away in the recesses, traveling around. I remember that she'd go to all sorts of places. She was very well traveled, well educated, and she'd gone over to New York and she found these Winnie the Pooh dolls, bears in one of the museums. And she made a comment about how they needed to be returned to the UK, saying that she detected great sadness in these bears, and they shouldn't be in New York, they should be over with us. And this turned into quite a big situation. So the mayor at the time, who's still knocking about in various guises, unfortunately Rudolph Giuliani, he vowed that those dolls were going to stay in America. Apparently this kind of issue with these Winnie the Pooh dolls made it to a conversation with Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. At the time, this was something that made the headlines about Gwyneth's fight to get the dolls back home. And I just thought that was quite a funny little thing that she would have found very funny as well, that it was taken so seriously by many. But she will have definitely wanted them to come back, and rightly so. Maybe we should restart that campaign if they're not back with us yet. So I spoke before just about this great friendship, Betty and Gwyneth, and this lovely quote that Betty gave after Gwyneth died. Of course, she was a big softie inside, but she had this fierce facade, particularly with the men in the Commons. Now, I was told this story actually by somebody when I went in about Gwyneth. So it's very well known in Parliament amongst people. Jack Straw wanted to run for the shadow cabinet, and he was very intimidated by Gwyneth. That was a normal thing for some of these men. And he plucked up the courage to ask if she would vote to him. And she replied, "I'll think about it if you clean my shoes." And I believe he did clean her shoes for that vote, but I'm not sure if she voted for him. I wouldn't be able to comment, but yeah, she was somebody that was feared by people who have seemed quite fearsome to us probably. She was somebody who is incredibly generous and very smart, and Betty Boothroyd describes that here. She was a woman with great generosity of spirit. She was unrivaled in her intellect, her determination, her hard work for the Labour Party in Parliament, and her outspokenness. She was her own woman. She was very special, and said by somebody else who was very, very special. Just a fantastic Speaker of the House. Gwyneth did go to try and be Speaker of the House at one point, was unsuccessful, but she was at that point when she died, she was the longest serving female in Parliament. That record's been beaten now, I think, but yeah, she had her chair in Parliament, and it was shown to me when I went in, and she still to that day was incredibly well thought of. Got a little clip now because I think on that note, it would be great, Kate, if we're all right for time and stuff, just to share. There might be a little bit at the beginning to move it forward. So it's when Gwyneth died, and it was
Yeah, I think I've got it ready. Here goes.
amazing.
Just let me know about sound if you put your thumbs up.
Okay.
1 minute.
Vinegar Lil for her withering criticisms and steadfast adherence to...
Sorry, I'll start again.
She earned herself the nickname Vinegar Lil for her withering criticisms and steadfast adherence to firm principle. She was, as Betty Boothroyd described her, a debunker of humbug. Today, politicians of all hues have paid tribute to a formidable parliamentarian and long-time chair of the Transport Select Committee, Gwyneth Dunwoody.
I long ago gave up expecting answers from government departments. Life is difficult, Prime Minister. Someone in rail track, Mr. Corbett, must take responsibility for something.
She was a battle axe, her words, rather than Batman. But all the same, there was a little of the caped crusader about Gwyneth Dunwoody. Trouser-suited anyway. Like her husband, she was elected to Parliament in the Labour interest in the 60s. There was a flash of the Dunwoody steel in one of her early interviews, as well as some formidable millinery.
I think I've done all the sort of groundwork first, you know, delivering leaflets and writing up and making tea and buns. I think you've got to start that way before you can move on into the other realms.
If I remember rightly, you were thrown out in the early days.
I was not thrown out.
Mrs. Dunwoody once complained that husbands didn't give their wives flowers often enough. The next day, florists queued at the Commons with bouquets for her. There were more today.
She was a signpost and not a weathercock. The signpost points the way and says, this is the way it should go. You don't have to agree with it, but if you come back in 10 years, the signpost is there. The weathercock, always studying the opinion polls and the focus groups and the spin doctors. I've no time for weathercocks, and Gwyneth was a signpost.
Mrs. Dunwoody was the longest-serving woman MP, but she was best known as a kind of Norman Hunter of politics, biting the legs of ministers, even if they were nominally on her side.
What we do on the select committees matters. It matters because the House of Commons must never become a great morass of people doing what they are told, not by the electorate, but by the executive.
She chaired the Transport Select Committee, despite efforts by New Labour grandees to kick her off it.
I think it's really a bit sad. They've got a very large majority, they're totally in control, their opposition is in disarray, and yet they can't afford to have people asking awkward questions. Tells you more about them, I think.
I described her as being the secret love child of Leonid Brezhnev and Ina Sharples. And I thought she might take offence at this, but in fact she loved it and was extraordinarily nice to me ever since. I'll miss her. She was a real character. She had a marvellous voice too. She was very unpackaged. She was very unformulaic. And this voice like the creak on a coffin, I once described it.
But there is no easy way of dealing with this.
Life is difficult, Prime Minister. Yeah. You have differentiated between the two different...
Thank you for acknowledging that.
I thought it was what you were paying for. Forgive me.
Tributes there to Gwyneth Dunwoody.
She and I have never...
Right, hang on. Let me get it off quick enough.
You're doing a marvellous job, thank you. I just think that is just some great footage, and it's amazing when you have kind of known somebody how certain things stick with you. And I was walking only recently, I can't remember quite where I was, but somebody walked past and they had the same perfume on that Gwyneth used to wear. I know 100% it was, and I could tell straight away, and I thought, I really like, it's not something I would wear, but it was a beautiful smell that my brain just linked in with her. And I'm kicking myself because I didn't ask the person what brand it was. I'd like to find out. So I'm not trying to be self-indulgent here with my personal story with Gwyneth. This is about Gwyneth. But the reason that I've included these pictures is because, as I touched on earlier, I would never have been able to get into that position without the support that Gwyneth showed my dad, and without that opening into politics and fairness and debate that she gave me, and that grounding and that interest, and those days listening in the Labour Party meetings with my ear up against the door. And I think that insight, although I never thought I would go to Parliament, again, that support that she showed my father was just massive. And he told me this little story before. My dad's 81 now, and he told me about being invited to go to the Queen's Garden Party with Gwyneth, and him and my mum went down. My parents aren't necessarily royalists. They are, my dad is from a small mining community up in Scotland, but they are huge fans of Gwyneth, and they went along very smartly, and they were honoured to go with her as the guests. And they stayed at her flat, and this generous spirit that Betty Boothroyd spoke about, my parents felt, and they stayed with her, and they had kind of a lovely meal, and she just made it so fabulous for them. And they were having a really difficult time financially, and their life was definitely not one of garden parties and wine and meals, etc. And she just wanted to give them that bit of sparkle, and she really managed to. And another occasion was she took them to visit the Duke of Devonshire at Chatsworth House. And I didn't know any of this. I'm going to do a bit of more research on it, but the Duke of Devonshire was married to the last of the Mitford sisters, number 6, I believe. So this big dynasty again. And he had got in touch with Gwyneth because he knew that she was speaking in his constituency, and invited her to come for a tour of Chatsworth House. And she took my mum and dad and her secretary from the Crewe and Nantwich Labour Party office, Margaret Holland. And as they went in, my dad described that there was this lady who was gardening with a headscarf on, and she was down in the mud with her gloves on, etc. And Gwyneth kind of went over and said, "Do you mind telling us how we reach the Duke of Devonshire and where we'll find him?" And this lady pointed them in the right direction. It turned out she was actually this Mitford sister who was down in the dirt doing the weeding, etc. So off they went to meet the Duke of Devonshire. And my dad said that it came to the introductions, and Gwyneth got into her role, and she introduced Margaret as her long-serving secretary, Margaret Holland. My mother was described as my very dear friend Jeanette, and my dad got and this is my driver, Hamilton. And he said at this point he wished he'd had a little hat on and docked it, and that was the role that she kind of carved out. He told me another great story before. They were driving around Blackpool, and she would sit in the front, and they would just laugh and laugh and laugh, and she had this great laugh. And she was telling him what direction he needed to go in, and this is before sat-navs, etc. And he was saying, no, that isn't the way to go. She was trying to direct him round one-way streets in Blackpool, etc. And in the end, Dad actually turned the engine off and said, "Right, Gwyneth, there's the keys, you can do it." And she was one of the few people, I think, who probably ever did something like that. But that was the kind of amazing relationship they did have. And I feel very blessed because it's great to talk about her and to research her as this parliamentarian. But I'm just really glad that I kind of saw that other side, because she was a grandmother, a mother. She was very, very warm, and just a great, great soul. We go to the next slide. Yeah, so I thought in her own words I would do the last little bit. Sorry, the wording's not quite word. I found this, so some of the quotes that she said about various things. So on herself, she said, "I have no problem being called a battle axe. They're very well made, very sharp, and largely very efficient at what they do." On herself as well, she said she was really a charming little girl. She never upset anybody. She was a puddy cat. On Blair's Babes. Now, I remember this when Tony Blair had this picture taken of everybody. And I remember she was outraged at this idea that she was one of Blair's babes, because she obviously, for many reasons, but she described it as those who like young wines and young women don't have much of a palate. On feminism, I do like this quote. I believe we will have true equality when we've got as many stupid women as we've got stupid men. I think this is really important, actually, because there are some things. I consider myself a feminist, 100%. I consider myself to have Labour value politics in the same way as Gwyneth. There 100% will have been things that we would probably have disagreed on, but I massively respect her opinion. I think it's important that we don't look at people with that kind of rose-tinted. There would have been things to have debate. I would have been completely different to Gwyneth on certain areas with regards to women's rights, etc. But my God, I would have loved to hear her opinion. I'm sure she'd have changed my opinion on certain things. I've got no doubt about it. She had no time for the breastfeeding debate happening in Parliament. She saw Parliament as a place to obviously go and work, and you know, that was her view. For me, it was, I was very grateful for the fact they had more flexible kind of working that was able to allow me to go in with my children. But it's, you can have that debate and not fall out with people, not hate people, not disagree with them on everything. I wish we would kind of get back to a bit of that. I love this quote about Andrew Neil, because I'm not a massive fan of Andrew Neil, I have to say. And he was complaining to her about not having been served his breakfast on a first class railway journey. And she said she just sort of did this withering look, and that may have been to your advantage, she said, whilst glaring at his paunch, which I thought was quite funny. On the Labour Party, yeah, she described it as, I think I've stood still and the Labour Party has revolved around me like a top. I thought this, yeah, on her commute to her constituency, which was obviously Crewe, every Friday by Mr. Virgin's Middle England Mystery Tours. And Dad was often, well, he was the person who used to pick her up, and she used to stay at like Crewe Hall and Rockery Hall quite often. It was a bit different in those days. And I'll finish with this last little quote. I've been in the House long enough to see the comings and goings of many inadequate personalities. I have seen those on both sides of the House who have been promoted for various reasons. I have seen the crawlers. I have seen those who have used sex. I have seen those whose sexual preferences were of interest to others. I have seen those who demonstrated a great commitment to their own interests, irrespective of the political parties they were supposed to represent. Name names, cried the MPs. Oh, Dunwoody replied, there are so many it would take too long. Not much has changed, it's just got worse, I think. But yeah, it's I think that's my last slide. I'm really happy to kind of take part in any discussion. I think it's important to say, like I've said throughout, and you, Gwyneth, as a small girl, admired her greatly. I was very lucky to be able to walk in a little bit in the footsteps kind of that she carved out, and see the actual inner workings of Parliament. But the thing that I am most grateful for is I genuinely feel that at a very difficult time, she probably had an impact in saving my dad's mental well-being, and she did that completely selflessly. So
thank you. So no, thank you so much. Anyone got any questions? Mine's a very girly question, just about a fashion that, like say, she really did look very like Hollywood-ish. She was really stylish, wasn't she? And in them younger, like say, I probably only know her from the latter days of when she's really been our MP for a while. Anybody else got any question? Take yourself off mute. Yeah, go on, Claire.
I just think for me, she had such a wonderful way with words, didn't she? And I found that quote about the battle axe too, and I just thought that's just perfect, isn't it?
It's great.
It's just perfect.
Yeah. I think she had this way with humour of spinning things round and making people feel probably quite foolish without being rude. She was light years ahead of most people in the space. And yeah, I had great fun reading some of her quotes, and I loved what Tony Benn said, who was somebody I greatly admire politically as well. And I love how he said you have weather vanes in politics and you have signposts. She was a signpost. And that is so true. And it's so hard to be that, because that whole Westminster machine, it works against people to try and make them conform and to make them isolated. And she was just too big a stronger personality to allow any of that nonsense to happen to her. On the fashion as well, Kate, I know that she had a dressmaker that she would go to in Nantwich. And she used to always, when she'd come up to the constituency, she'd do her surgeries in Nantwich Library. She would then go around the markets, go and talk to people. She'd go to her dressmakers who would do alterations on her clothes. And yeah, just fab. And she smelt great, as I say.
I think she always made, obviously don't know that well, but I think because we have to think of that time, she was one of the only females that she did make it. She wasn't a whinger in that. Although I will say, and not thinking it, I have read that she wasn't necessarily as supportive. She was more of a man than a woman. She didn't offer the ladder down. A few people have told me that a lot, mainly because perhaps she found it more easy than other women had found it.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. It's one of those for the debate, isn't it? And I do feel the same in that with feminism and how we can kind of, as women, be able to get forward. Sometimes people have asked me about, well, it's great when you have certain females in positions of power, but it is all about how they use that power and what that politics is. And I think Gwyneth probably was a little bit fed up with some of the identity politics, or the fact that some women had come in, but then they weren't using their voice in the way that they potentially could, or on some of those issues that, I'm speaking just, this is my opinion. I 100% think she was an ally to women. I think she probably just her views were a bit different in some ways, in the same way as debates today, right? It's not black and white. And what I hope that, we manage to kind of get through is that people and women can see the things that they agree on, more than the things that divide them. But yeah, I mean, she wasn't she'd hold her own. I know she didn't get on with Harriet Harman one little bit.
I've read the book Women of Westminster, and it says it in there, and then I've read another book and it said in there, I think perhaps because she found it easy, probably easier than some other women in politics, maybe.
And as I say, for me, it was when I was out door knocking and stuff, the amount of people who said to me, and I was against Edward Timpson in 2017, who said to me, how are you going to go to Parliament? You've got children. Who's going to look after your children? And I just used to say, are you saying the same to Edward? But Gwyneth didn't, she at that point, and maybe it would have changed, I don't know, but she wasn't so into the idea of Parliament becoming more child friendly at that point.
Anyone else? Any questions at all? No, it's been really fascinating. There was loads I didn't know, actually. Found that really, really interesting. And probably one we need to look at to have more of the thing, Claire, in the work that we're doing as well. I mean, obviously we've got the Dunwoody Way, but is her story really captured for what she was known for in the political world? Her story's not told very much, is it?
No, and I think the great thing is locally, she is so well regarded by so many still, and rightly so, and held kind of very highly. And yeah, I feel that there's a bit more that could be said and done. They did something in Nantwich Library about Gwyneth at one point. She's got the bench in Nantwich, but even getting the bench put in, that was a real struggle for the people fundraising for that. And no, I think she was, well, I'm a big fan of her, although I definitely didn't agree with her on everything.
But like you say, I think that it's a great role model for somebody that, you know, really loved Crewe and championed, well, Crewe and Nantwich eventually. But you know, that's important for us to keep her story alive, isn't it? For that reason, really.
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely.
Thank you ever so much. It's really, really interesting, and I love some of them YouTube clips as well.
Yeah, it's great. I really enjoyed researching everything, actually. If you can share the link with me, because I'll show my dad and he'll tell me all the things that I didn't say that I could have said.
I'll just stop recording and then won't be a second.